Karen aimed her pepper spray at the royal guard's face, thinking she could blind him into submission, but his eyes of steel left everybody around speechless. Here's what happened. Before we continue, let us know in the comments below where you're watching from. Subscribe to the channel as tomorrow, at the same time, we bring you another remarkable display of Royal Guard valor that you won't want to miss. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grounds of Buckingham Palace as Sarah Whitmore strode through the gathering crowds, her designer handbag swinging with each forceful step. Her carefully manicured nails gripped her phone like talons, her face set in the perpetual expression of someone who believed the world owed her an explanation. "Excuse me," she barked at a young family trying to take photos, shouldering past them without waiting for a response. "Some of us have actual business here." Her heels clicked against the courtyard stones like small thunderclaps, each step radiating entitlement. At 45, Sarah carried herself with the aggressive confidence of someone who had made complaining into an art form. Her platinum blonde hair, cut in an expensive asymmetrical bob that screamed, "I need to speak to your supervisor," framed a face perpetually set in judgment. The silver pendant hanging from her neck bore her initials in designer script, matching the monogram on her white linen blazer that proclaimed her status as Regional Customer Relations Director, a title she wielded like a weapon. The summer heat had drawn larger crowds than usual to the palace grounds, but Sarah moved through them as if they were mere inconveniences in her personal space. A street vendor quietly pulled his cart aside as she approached, recognizing the storm clouds gathering in her expression. Nearby tourists exchanged knowing glances, the kind shared between travelers who had encountered similar characters in their journeys. "This is ridiculous," she announced to no one in particular, her voice carrying the sharp edge of practiced indignation. "They expect us to stand around in this heat just to see some man in a costume." Her eyes scanned the crowd like a predator seeking prey, finally settling on the royal guard standing at attention nearby. The guard's scarlet tunic gleamed in the afternoon light, each brass button and medal telling its own story of service and dedication. His posture was perfect, eyes fixed forward with the discipline that came from years of military training. But to Sarah, he represented something else entirely, an authority that hadn't yet bent to her will. She paused, tilting her head as if puzzled by a particularly offensive display in a shop window. The guard's unwavering gaze, focused on some distant point, as protocol demanded, seemed to trigger something in her. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the same expression she wore before demanding to speak to yet another manager. "Well," she muttered, adjusting her blazer with sharp, aggressive movements, "we'll just see about this, won't we?" The crowds continued to shift around her, but now they moved with greater urgency, sensing the brewing confrontation. Parents guided their children to safer vantage points, while more experienced tourists recognized the telltale signs of an impending scene. The guard remained motionless, his bearing a stark contrast to Sarah's agitated movements. Years of military service had taught him to recognize approaching trouble, but his training had prepared him for far worse than an entitled civilian with a grudge. Or so he thought. What happened next would test not just his training, but the very essence of what it meant to wear the Queen's Guard uniform. Sarah Whitmore stalked toward the guard with the practiced stride of someone used to making others uncomfortable. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of forced politeness that promised trouble. "I couldn't help but notice you staring at me." The guard remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward as centuries of tradition and training demanded. The brass buttons of his tunic caught the afternoon light, each one reflecting Sarah's increasingly annoyed expression as she moved closer. "I said," she repeated, raising her voice and stepping directly into his line of sight, "you were staring at me. Don't pretend you didn't hear me." Her designer handbag swung from her arm like a pendulum marking the moments before an explosion. "I know what I saw." A young couple nearby exchanged worried glances, the wife whispering something to her husband as they carefully created distance between themselves and the unfolding scene. Other tourists began to lower their cameras, sensing that they were about to witness something far less pleasant than the usual ceremonial display. "This is exactly what's wrong with men in uniform," Sarah announced, loud enough for everyone in the vicinity to hear. "You think that costume gives you the right to make women feel uncomfortable?" She crossed her arms, blocking part of his view with deliberate defiance. "I work in customer relations, you know. I know all about proper conduct and harassment policies." The guard's eyes remained fixed, looking through her as if she were made of glass. His discipline was evident in every line of his bearing, from his perfectly polished boots to the bearskin cap that added to his already impressive height. But Sarah seemed to take his professional composure as a personal affront. "Oh, so now you're going to ignore me?" Her voice rose another octave. "Is that how the British military treats concerned citizens?" She pulled out her phone, holding it up like a shield. "I have half a mind to report this. I'm sure your superiors would be very interested to know how their guards behave around female tourists." A father quickly ushered his children away, murmuring something about seeing the palace from a different angle. An elderly couple shook their heads in disapproval, though whether at Sarah or the situation itself wasn't clear. The afternoon had taken on the tense atmosphere of an approaching storm. "Look at him, everyone," Sarah turned to address the reluctant audience, her arms spread wide in theatrical indignation. "Standing there, pretending he wasn't just staring at me like some... She fumbled for words, her frustration mounting at the guard's continued silence. "This is a public space. I have the right to feel safe." The guard's composure remained unbroken, his training evident in every steady breath and unwavering gaze. Years of military service had taught him to maintain discipline under far worse conditions than an entitled tourist's baseless accusations. His medals, earned in real combat, caught the sunlight as Sarah continued her performance. "I bet you do this to all the women who come here, don't you?" she pressed, her voice dripping with accusation. "Standing there in your little costume thinking you can intimidate people?" She stepped even closer, her expensive perfume mixing with the afternoon heat. "Well, you've picked the wrong woman to harass. I've dealt with plenty of men who thought their position made them untouchable." A street vendor quietly packed up his cart and moved away, experience having taught him to recognize when a situation was about to escalate beyond mere tourist drama. The crowd had thinned considerably around Sarah and the guard, creating an invisible ring of tension that even casual observers seemed hesitant to cross. "Last chance," Sarah declared, her voice carrying that dangerous edge of someone unused to being ignored. "Either acknowledge what you did and apologize, or things are going to get very unpleasant for you." Her hand tightened on her handbag, knuckles whitening with barely contained rage. "I'm not some helpless woman you can intimidate into silence. I know my rights, and I know how to defend myself." The guard remained as immobile as the palace itself, his eyes fixed on that distant point that protocol demanded. But there was something in his bearing now, not fear, not anger, but the quiet readiness of a soldier who sensed approaching danger. The afternoon sun cast his shadow long across the courtyard stones, a silent reminder of the weight of duty he carried. Sarah's face darkened with fury, her practiced composure cracking like expensive porcelain. "Fine," she hissed, reaching for her bag with trembling fingers. "If that's how you want to play this. You think this silent treatment is going to work?" Sarah's voice had taken on a dangerous edge, her carefully maintained professional demeanor crumbling with each passing moment. "I've broken men with far more authority than you." She circled the guard like a predator, each click of her heels against the courtyard stones marking another tick toward inevitable confrontation. A small group of Japanese tourists quickly gathered their belongings and moved away, their tour guide quietly shepherding them towards safer ground. The afternoon heat seemed to intensify, matching the rising tension in the air. Let's review the situation, shall we? Sarah's tone shifted into the same condescending rhythm she used when dressing down junior employees. First, you stared at me inappropriately. Then, when confronted, you chose to ignore me completely. She punctuated each point by jabbing her finger in the guard's direction. And now you're continuing this aggressive silence as a form of intimidation. The guard's eyes remained fixed forward, his posture perfect despite the verbal onslaught. Years of military training had taught him to maintain composure under far worse conditions than a civilian's baseless accusations. But there was something in Sarah's mounting anger that spoke of escalation to come. "Do you have any idea who I am?" She pulled herself up to her full height, though she still barely reached the guard's shoulder. "I sit on 3 community boards. I've had men fired for less than what you're doing right now." Her voice carried across the courtyard, causing several palace pigeons to take startled flight. This kind of behaviour might have been acceptable in the Dark Ages when all this, she gestured dismissively at the palace, was relevant, but we live in a modern world with modern standards. An elderly man in a veteran's cap watched from nearby, his weathered face showing concern as he observed the scene. His hand rested unconsciously on his own service medals as he watched Sarah's increasingly aggressive movements. "I've dealt with men like you before," she continued, her voice taking on a shrill edge, "hidden behind uniforms, thinking they're above the rules that govern everyone else." She dug through her designer handbag with sharp, angry movements. "Always assuming your position protects you from consequences." The guard's bearing hadn't changed, but there was a subtle tension in his jaw now, the kind that came from years of real combat experience, recognizing genuine threat. His ceremonial rifle remained perfectly positioned, each brass fitting gleaming in the afternoon sun that seemed to grow harsher with each passing moment. "Everyone's watching, you know," Sarah announced, turning to address the remaining onlookers who hadn't yet retreated to safer distances. "They're all seeing how you're treating a woman who's merely standing up for herself. Is this what the British military teaches its men? To harass and intimidate civilians?" A young mother hurried past, pulling her curious children away from the scene. "But Mummy, why is that lady being so mean to the guard?" The innocent question carried clearly in the tense atmosphere, causing Sarah's face to flush with even deeper anger. "Mean?" She whirled toward the retreating family. "I'm protecting everyone here from this... She struggled for words, her composure slipping further. "This abuse of power." Her hand disappeared into her bag again, emerging with something small and metallic that caught the sunlight. "Someone has to stand up to these people who think a uniform makes them untouchable." The veteran took a half step forward, recognition dawning in his eyes as he spotted what Sarah was clutching. But before he could speak, she had already turned back to the guard, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Last warning," she hissed, close enough now that her breath disturbed the medals on his chest. "Either acknowledge what you did and apologize, or I'll show you exactly how a modern woman deals with harassment." The small canister in her hand glinted ominously. "Your choice, soldier boy. We can do this the easy way, or we can do this my way." The guard's eyes remained forward, his training holding firm even as his combat experience screamed warnings about the imminent threat. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the courtyard, turning the scene into a stark tableau of impending confrontation. "Time's up," Sarah declared, her voice carrying that final note of someone who believed they were about to deliver righteous justice. "Let's see how well you maintain that superior attitude after this." The veteran was already moving forward, his own military training recognizing the signs of imminent attack. But Sarah had already raised the pepper spray, her finger tightening on the trigger with the same decisiveness she used to sign termination notices. The afternoon air shattered with the sharp hiss of the pepper spray, its caustic mist catching the sunlight like toxic diamonds as Sarah unleashed the full canister directly into the guard's face. "Let's see you ignore this," she snarled, her aim unwavering as she emptied the entire contents toward his unprotected eyes. Time seemed to slow. Tourists gasped and recoiled, phones dropping forgotten as the reality of what they were witnessing sank in. A child began to cry somewhere in the crowd. The veteran broke into a run, his old combat instincts kicking in, but he was too far to prevent what was already unfolding. But the guard! The guard didn't move. His eyes remained open, unflinching as the chemical assault battered against them. Not a muscle twitched, not a step faltered. The caustic spray ran down his face like tears, but his expression remained as immovable as the palace walls behind him. Years of military training, of real combat experience, of standing firm in the face of genuine threats, culminated in this moment of extraordinary discipline. Sarah's triumphant expression faltered, then crumbled into confusion as she realized her attack had failed to produce the expected response. The empty canister slipped from her fingers, clattering against the courtyard stones with an accusatory ring. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice thick with disbelief. "You should be." She took a stumbling step backward, her designer heels catching on the uneven ground. "Why aren't you—" The guard's face was wet with the chemical spray, his eyes undoubtedly burning with an intensity few civilians could comprehend, but his posture remained perfect, his gaze steady, his discipline unbroken. Small rivulets of the caustic liquid traced paths down his scarlet tunic, staining the immaculate uniform, but failing to stain the dignity it represented. The veteran finally reached them, his campaign medals jingling with the momentum of his approach. "Dear God," he breathed, taking in the scene with the experienced eye of someone who had seen combat. "In 30 years of service, I've never—" The crowd had gone absolutely silent. Even the ever-present London traffic seemed muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The afternoon sun highlighted every detail of the scene. The guard's unwavering stance, the spreading stains on his uniform, Sarah's rapidly paling face as the magnitude of her actions began to sink in. "You just assaulted a member of Her Majesty's Armed Forces," the veteran stated, his voice carrying the weight of military authority. He reached into his jacket, producing a water bottle and a clean handkerchief. "Son, at least let me help you clear your eyes." Sarah's legs seemed to give way, and she sank onto a nearby bench, her designer handbag falling forgotten at her feet. The reality of what she'd done was finally breaking through her wall of entitlement. I was just... But before she could finish, something changed in the air. The guard, who had remained motionless through the entire assault, slowly turned his head. His eyes, though undoubtedly burning with unimaginable pain, fixed directly on Sarah, with a gaze that carried the weight of every soldier who had ever stood firm in the face of adversity. When he spoke, his voice was steady, controlled, and carried the kind of authority that could only be earned through real service and sacrifice. The kind of authority that made Sarah's earlier claims of power seem like a child playing dress-up in comparison. "Hold still, son," the veteran said softly, his weathered hands steady as he raised the water bottle. "I've seen my share of CS gas in training. This isn't much different." He spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had been through worse, much worse. His movements were precise, efficient, the kind of care that came from years of treating battlefield injuries. The water ran clear over the guard's face, carrying away the worst of the chemical assault. The white handkerchief, carefully folded into a precise square, dabbed at the guard's eyes with paternal gentleness. 22 years in the Royal Marines, the veteran continued, his voice carrying just far enough for Sarah to hear every word. Served in the Falklands, Iraq, Northern Ireland. But what this young man just did, he shook his head in quiet admiration. That's the kind of discipline they write about in training manuals. Sarah remained frozen on the bench, her earlier bravado completely evaporated, The pepper spray canister lay where it had fallen, a silent testament to her monumental miscalculation. "You see these medals?" The veteran gestured to the guard's chest with his free hand. "They're not decorative. Each one tells a story of service, sacrifice, and the kind of courage you clearly don't understand." His voice carried decades of military pride. "This uniform isn't a costume, madam. It's earned through blood, sweat, and the kind of training that lets a man stand unflinching while being attacked by a civilian he's sworn to protect." The guard remained at attention, accepting the veteran's aid with quiet dignity. His eyes were reddened but focused, his bearing still perfect despite the assault he'd endured. The water had left dark patches on his scarlet tunic, but somehow they looked more like badges of honor than stains. "I was there, you know," the veteran continued, carefully wiping the last traces of spray from the guard's face. "When they train these men, it's not just about standing still and looking impressive for tourists. Every guard you see here is a combat-qualified soldier. They've faced real threats, real danger, not just entitled civilians with pepper spray." Sarah's hands trembled in her lap as the veteran's words cut through her remaining defenses. The crowd had drawn closer again, but now their faces showed a mixture of awe for the guard's composure and disapproval for her actions. "There you are, son," the veteran said, stepping back to inspect his work. "Not quite regulation shine on those buttons anymore, but under the circumstances." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I think even Her Majesty would understand." The guard's eyes, though still reddened from the attack, held steady. Something passed between the two men, an unspoken understanding that only those who had worn the uniform could truly comprehend. The veteran straightened, his own military bearing returning as he delivered a crisp salute that spoke volumes about the respect he held for the younger soldier's display of discipline. "Now then," the veteran turned to face Sarah, his voice taking on an edge of steel, "I believe this young man has earned the right to speak. And, madam," he fixed her with the kind of stare that had once commanded men in battle, "I suggest you listen very carefully to what he has to say. In Afghanistan," the guard's voice rang out with parade ground authority, each word precise despite the lingering burn of the pepper spray, "I once held position under heavy fire for 6 hours to protect wounded civilians." His eyes, still reddened but unflinching, locked onto Sarah with sniper's focus. "Your pepper spray, madam, doesn't quite compare to Taliban artillery." Sarah seemed to shrink further into herself with each word, her expensive blazer offering no protection against the weight of his quiet authority. The guard continued, his voice carrying the kind of command that came from real battlefield experience. "This uniform," he gestured to his stained tunic, "has been worn in every major conflict for centuries. The men who wore it before me didn't just stand guard at a palace. They fought at Waterloo, stormed the beaches at Normandy, held the line in Korea. Each word landed like artillery fire. And you thought you could break that legacy with a civilian-grade pepper spray?" The veteran nodded slowly, his own medals catching the fading sunlight. The crowd had drawn closer, pulled in by the power of the guard's words and the underlying steel in his voice. "Let me educate you about what you really attacked today." The guard's voice took on an edge that could have cut diamond. "This isn't just a uniform. It's a symbol of every sacrifice made to ensure people like you can walk freely through these gates. These medals?" He touched his chest. "They're not decorative. Each one was earned in combat zones you couldn't find on a map." Sarah's face had lost all colour, her earlier righteous indignation replaced by growing horror as the reality of her actions sank in. The guard's next words seemed to echo off the palace walls. "You accused me of staring, of harassment, of intimidation." His voice carried a cold fury now, controlled but unmistakable. "Would you like to know what I was actually looking at? That fixed point we're trained to maintain? It's a memorial To fallen comrades who gave their lives so entitled civilians could have the freedom to make spectacularly poor decisions. The veteran's face showed grim approval as the guard continued, each word carrying the weight of centuries of military tradition. "Your pepper spray burned, madam. I won't deny that." His composure remained absolute, making his next words even more powerful. "But I've carried wounded men through firefights. I've felt real pain, the kind that comes from putting others before yourself. That's what this uniform teaches us. That's what you failed to understand." Sarah's lips trembled as she tried to form words, but the guard wasn't finished. His voice dropped lower, somehow becoming even more commanding. "You wanted a reaction. Here it is. I pity you." The words fell like hammer blows. "I pity anyone who sees a soldier standing guard and thinks victim, who mistakes discipline for weakness, who believes their personal grievances outweigh centuries of duty and sacrifice." Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now, but they weren't the manipulative tears she'd used to get away in countless customer service confrontations. These were real, the kind that came from finally facing the magnitude of one's own actions. "The Queen's Guard isn't just a tourist attraction, madam." His voice carried the full weight of military authority now. "We're combat soldiers who choose to serve ceremonially while maintaining operational readiness." "That pepper spray?" He gestured to the discarded canister. "We train with worse. The chemical burns you just inflicted. They're nothing compared to what we endure to earn this uniform." The silence in the courtyard was absolute as he delivered his final words. "You came here looking for attention, trying to prove some point about power and authority. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why we stand guard. To protect a society that allows even people like you to enjoy freedoms you clearly don't appreciate." Sarah was openly sobbing now, her carefully applied makeup running in dark streaks down her face. The guard's words had stripped away every layer of her entitled armor, leaving her exposed to the harsh reality of her own behavior. "The police will be here shortly," he concluded, his voice carrying a note of finality. "I suggest you use these last few moments of freedom to reflect on the difference between real strength and the kind you tried to demonstrate today." Soon after, the police officers arrived and led Sarah Whitmore away, her designer handbag confiscated as evidence. The afternoon sun painted the palace grounds in hues of amber and gold. Her shoulders, once squared with self-importance, now slouched with the weight of her actions. The click of her designer heels against the courtyard stones no longer commanded attention. Instead, they marked the retreating steps of someone who had finally learned the true meaning of authority. The veteran stood quietly nearby, his weathered face showing the satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice properly served. He gathered his empty water bottle and damp handkerchief, offering one final salute to the guard before melting back into the crowd. The guard's uniform, though bearing the evidence of Sarah's assault, seemed to gleam with renewed dignity in the fading light. Each water stain and chemical mark told its own story of unwavering discipline in the face of ignorance. His eyes, still reddened but resolute, resumed their vigil over the palace grounds. Needless to say, the incident had left more than just physical marks. It had demonstrated that true power lies not in the ability to attack, but in the strength to stand unmoved in the face of adversity. What would you have done in this guard's position? Could you maintain such unwavering discipline in the face of a direct attack, or would your instincts have taken over? More importantly, what does this incident teach us about the true nature of strength? Is it found in the ability to strike out, or in the discipline to stand firm? Perhaps the greatest power lies not in our ability to retaliate, but in our choice to stand unmoved in the face of adversity. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about dignity and respect. Hit that bell icon to never miss our uploads, and check out our other videos appearing on your screen right now. See you in the next one. And remember, true strength often speaks most loudly through silence.